Western Germany, 1944. Allied forces pushed eastward as the war collapsed inward on itself. By late autumn, the roads were crowded with movement that no longer had clear direction. Columns of refugees moved alongside retreating military units. Trains still ran, but without schedules anyone trusted. Rail lines that once moved coal and soldiers with industrial precision now carried anything that could still be moved: supplies, wounded men, displaced civilians, prisoners, and sometimes nothing but sealed cars rolling without purpose. It was early morning when a U.S. infantry patrol came across the train. It stood motionless on a siding outside a small industrial town that had been abandoned days earlier. The station building was empty. The surrounding factories were silent. No guards, no officers, no engine crew. The locomotive sat cold, its fire long dead. The cars behind it were sealed boxcars, wooden freight cars, not passenger coaches. As the patrol approached, one of the men noticed movement through a narrow ventilation slit. Another heard something faint, too weak to be shouting, too irregular to be machinery. A sound like wood being tapped from inside, then a voice, thin, cracked, female. Lieutenant Morrison ordered the men to stop. They listened. From inside the sealed cars came knocking, then coughing. Then a word repeated again and again in German. Hilf. Help. The Americans forced the door open. What they found inside the first car didn't look like prisoners in any sense they recognized. Dozens of women were crammed together, collapsed against each other on the floor, on makeshift bedding made from coats and rags. Some were sitting upright but swaying, barely conscious. Others were lying completely still. The air inside the car was thick with the smell of sickness, waste, and rot. Many of the women didn't react when the door opened. Several did, but not with relief. They recoiled. Hands went up instinctively. Some screamed weakly. Others cried. One woman near the door scrambled backward, dragging herself across the floor as if distance alone could save her. Then one voice cut through the confusion. Beat, stop. Infiziert. Please stop, I'm infected. The American soldiers froze. The woman who spoke was young, maybe in her early 20s. Her hair had been cut unevenly, likely by hand. Her face was sunken, skin stretched tight over cheekbones. She pressed herself against the wall of the car, palms raised, shaking. Don't touch me, she said again in broken English. Please, I'm infected. Behind her, several others repeated the same word. Infected. Lieutenant Morrison ordered his men to step back. In 1944, disease terrified soldiers almost as much as bullets. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, epidemics spread rapidly among displaced populations. American units had strict orders to isolate suspected cases. Medical officers were scarce, overstretched, and already dealing with outbreaks among liberated prisoners elsewhere. The instinct of the soldiers was clear. Close the door, mark the car, call it in, move on. But as they hesitated, Corporal Hayes noticed something else. The women weren't attacking them. They weren't rushing the door. They weren't even trying to escape. They were begging the Americans not to come closer. That changed everything. Lieutenant Morrison stepped forward slowly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. He asked questions through Sergeant Fisher, who spoke German. Who were they? Why were they here? Where were the guards? The answers came slowly, haltingly, overlapping as more women tried to speak. They were German civilians, factory workers, clerks, students. Some had been evacuated from cities destroyed by bombing. Others had been arrested for minor offenses, black market trading, refusing labor assignments, criticizing the regime. A few had been auxiliary workers attached to military units that no longer existed. Weeks earlier, they had been loaded onto trains under guard, told they were being relocated west, away from the advancing front. Then the guards disappeared. The train stopped. The doors were locked from the outside. No food, little water, no medical care. People began to get sick. First it was diarrhea, then fever, then rashes. Some women developed open sores, others began coughing blood. The strongest tried to care for the weakest, but supplies were gone within days. Clothing was torn into bandages. Snowmelt was collected in tin cups when the train stopped briefly at sidings. One by one, people died. The survivors had stopped counting. The Americans opened the other cars. Each one told the same story. Some were worse. In one car, more than half the occupants were already dead, bodies stacked against the walls because there was no space left on the floor. In another, only a handful were still alive, barely conscious, their breathing shallow and irregular. The soldiers stood in stunned silence. They had seen death before, on beaches, in hedgerows, in burned-out villages, but this was different. There had been no battle here, no resistance, no enemy fire, just abandonment. Lieutenant Morrison radioed headquarters immediately. Medical units were requested. Quarantine protocols were debated. Command wanted to know whether these women were prisoners, civilians, or enemy personnel. No one had an immediate answer. While they waited, the soldiers faced a choice: leave the women sealed until doctors arrived, or risk infection to begin helping now. It wasn't a heroic decision made with speeches or ceremony. It was quiet. Private Jackson simply stepped forward, removed his gloves, and offered his canteen through the door. Others followed. They didn't touch the women at first. Water was passed carefully. Bread rations were broken into small pieces. Too much food too quickly could kill starved people. The men remembered training about famine victims. Everything had to be slow, controlled. The woman who had first spoken, "I'm infected," watched as an American medic finally arrived hours later. He wore improvised protective gear and examined her carefully. She was feverish, malnourished, covered in lice bites, but she wasn't infected with typhus. Most of them weren't. The rashes came from malnutrition. The sores from prolonged exposure, lack of hygiene, and untreated injuries. Some had dysentery. A few had tuberculosis. But the fear had spread faster than disease. They had been told by guards, by rumors, by terror, that sickness meant death, that infection meant execution or abandonment. They believed it. Medical tents were set up near the tracks. The women who could walk were helped out first. Many collapsed immediately once they stood upright. Muscles that hadn't been used properly in weeks gave out. Some fainted in the snow. Those who couldn't walk were carried. The Americans moved carefully, methodically, documenting each person, tagging the cars, burning contaminated bedding. The dead were removed last. The women who survived watched silently as bodies were lifted out. Friends, sisters, strangers who had shared the same floor for weeks. No one cried. They were too exhausted. The survivors were transported to a temporary displaced persons camp under American control. There they were separated by condition, not nationality. The sick were isolated but treated. The weak were fed gradually. Lice were shaved away. Clothing was replaced. For many of the women, this was the first time in months that anyone had spoken to them calmly, without shouting or threats. Years later, some of the women would tell their families about the moment the doors opened, about the fear of infection, about begging soldiers not to touch them, about realizing slowly that no one was going to abandon them again.